If you've ever swallowed the silence of a family humiliation, you'll understand every word of this story. Subscribe to the channel and share your story with me, because no woman should ever face this alone. At my daughter's own engagement dinner, the groom smiled at the entire room and said, "After all, you're the one paying for everything, aren't you? Maybe we should put your name on the dessert menu as well." Some laughed. Others pretended not to hear. My daughter lowered her eyes. I simply raised my glass of water. And in that instant, I decided I would no longer be the wallet with lipstick at the end of the table, but the woman who would write the ending of that night. That morning began before the sun rose. The sky was still dark when my eyes opened on their own, without an alarm. It was as if my body already knew. Tonight would not be just a dinner. It would be a trial. I sat on the edge of the bed for a few minutes, listening only to the ticking of the clock. The silence of the house, broken now and then by the faint creak of the wooden floorboards, seemed to speak to me. I already knew what was coming. Not the exact words, not the exact details, but I knew it would be another night where I would be remembered not for who I am, but for what I've paid. I rose, slipped on my robe, and walked to the vanity. The mirror, cruel as always, reflected a 60-year-old woman. Silver hair, carefully styled, skin marked by time, but eyes still alive. Eyes that had seen too much to be easily deceived. I wanted to see strength there, but instead I found fatigue. The vanity drawer was half open. Inside, necklaces, rings, earrings, treasures that screamed with memories. I touched a pearl necklace, the first gift I ever bought for myself, with the paycheck from a low-wage job, but earned with dignity. Back then I worked 2 shifts, wrapping furniture, sewing curtains, riding crowded buses and subways. I can still smell the mix of dust and fresh fabric. I put the necklace on, fastened it behind my neck, and looked in the mirror. I didn't recognize myself. That wasn't an adornment, it was a scar. I took it off. I picked up another, a fine gold chain, a graduation gift from my daughter. Oh, that day, I cried so much. I cried because she walked in cap and gown, because she had succeeded. But I cried even more because only I knew the sleepless nights, the cheap dinners of macaroni and cheese, the clothes I never bought for myself, all so that she could hold a diploma in her hands. But I set that aside as well. I didn't want that night to be about sacrifices. I sighed and looked at a small silver locket, inside an old photo, me, holding my daughter when she was still little. I was smiling, so was she. I closed the drawer. I would take none of it with me. I chose a navy blue dress, heavy fabric, no sparkle, no loud colors. Blue had always been the color of defense. Blue was Alma. I dabbed perfume on my wrists, a discreet scent, almost invisible. Not to please anyone, only to remind myself that I still existed. In the kitchen, I made coffee. The silence of the house was deafening. I set the table as I used to, back when my daughter still lived here. Out of habit, I placed 2 cups. I smiled faintly at my own foolishness. She hadn't sat at that table in years. As I drank, thoughts invaded me. How many times had I told myself, it will be worth it? How many times did I save coins in envelopes, cut expenses, postpone dreams, always in the name of something greater? Today, I began to doubt if it had truly been worth it. I am a 60-year-old woman who carries on her body the maps of time. My silver hair falls in soft waves, not as a sign of weakness, but as medals of battle. My skin, etched with fine lines and invisible scars, holds the memory of sleepless nights and endless labor. My eyes, deep brown, have already seen abandonment, hard work, and small victories that few ever celebrated. In my walk, I carry the firmness of someone who has learned not to bow before contempt. And in my silence, the strength of someone who has already spoken what needed to be said. I am not young, but I am not fragile. I am the sum of every sacrifice made in the name of a daughter who now sees me only as a vault, forgetting that before money, I was her shelter, her roof, her bread. In the afternoon, the driver arrived. The invitation read formal attire. Not mother of the bride, not hostess, just guest. And the name printed, Margaret. No last name, no title, nothing. Just Margaret. As if I were just another chair in the room. On the way, I stayed silent. The car glided through the lit-up city, but inside me it was night. I asked myself, how will they look at me? How will they treat me? How will she, my daughter, act toward me? When the car pulled up to the restaurant, I took a deep breath. The building glowed golden, as if built of promises. Glass doors wide open, waiters in uniform moving quietly. I stepped out, adjusted my dress, lifted my chin. I entered. The dining hall was a spectacle. Mirrors reflected the glow of grand chandeliers, long tables draped with pristine linens, white lily arrangements in crystal vases, the scent of flowers mixed with the aroma of wine already swirling in glasses. And there, in the back, she was, my daughter, green silk dress, laughter like crystal. She seemed to shine, but it was not the shine of gratitude. It was the shine of someone who believes she is finally free of the shadow that raised her. Beside her, the groom, expensive suit, easy smile, sweeping gestures, the kind of man who speaks loudly not because he has something important to say, but because he needs everyone to look. I greeted a few guests along the way, received polite but distant smiles. No one seemed eager for my arrival. No one was waiting for me. At the table, I found my place, not beside her, not at the center, at the end, the seat of someone who takes up space, but not a place of honor. I sat, placed the napkin on my lap, looked around. The dinner seemed to flow, expensive dishes, laughter, conversations about vacations, business, topics that did not include me. I observed. I have always been better at observing than speaking. And then it happened. Between one glass and another, the groom lifted his cup, looked at me, and said, "After all, you're paying for everything, aren't you? Maybe we should add your name to the dessert menu." Some laughed. Others lowered their eyes. My daughter pretended not to hear. I felt my heart drop to my stomach. My hand trembled under the table, but my face, oh, my face remained steady. I picked up my glass of water, always the refuge of those who swallow in silence. And in that instant, something inside me broke. It wasn't just pride, it was certainty. I was not seen as a mother, not as a woman, not as a story. I was only the check. I swallowed hard, and, in silence, I began to plan. I remember the first time I truly found myself alone. My husband had just left, not with goodbye, but with silence. The silence of a door slamming without explanation. The silence of untouched plates. The silence of absence. He left me with a 4-year-old daughter in my arms, and a debt that seemed to laugh at my naivete that night. I sat on the kitchen floor. Cold linoleum pressed against my legs. The lights turned off to save on the electric bill. My daughter slept in the room next door, and I wondered how I would sustain a future that already felt like it was crushing me. The next morning, I started working 2 jobs. By day, a clerk in a discount furniture store. By night, an assistant in a carpentry shop, cataloging fabrics, sweeping sawdust, learning to name every piece of wood. My body was exhausted, but my mind couldn't stop. I kept telling myself, one day, she will study. One day, she will have everything I never had. Her childhood was marked by the sound of the alarm clock before sunrise. I would wake her, dress her quickly, hand her a cup of milk, and rush to the bus stop. Many mornings, she fell back asleep on my shoulder, her backpack slipping between us, and I, though exhausted, would smile, because I believed every drop of sweat was buying her future. On weekends, I turned the living room into a makeshift office. A thick notebook served as my ledger. There, I wrote down expenses, deadlines, goals. My daughter would sit beside me drawing, sometimes asking for attention, sometimes just doodling hearts in the margins. Back then, I believed she saw me as a heroine. Today, I wonder if she only saw a shadow too busy to play. When she turned 12, I quit the store and took the risk of starting my own small business, home renovation and interior design. It wasn't glamorous, it was sweat. I spent nights hauling fabric samples, begging for loans, listening to clients say, "Don't you think you should bring in a male architect?" I would smile, swallow my pride, and continue, because every signed contract meant another month of tuition paid. I remember the day she walked into her private school for the first time. Impeccable dress, new shoes, her hair tied back with a ribbon. She smiled at me and said, "Thank you, Mom. Now I'm like the other girls, that like the others cut me open." I didn't want her to be like the others. I wanted her to be more. In adolescence, the silences arrived, doors closing, short replies. I would say, "You don't know how hard I fought to give you this." She would answer, "I know, Mom, but I don't want to hear it all the time." Deep down, I understood. Those who carry too much weight sometimes make a point of showing it, and I showed it. I showed it in every word, Every warning, every reminder. Her graduation day was my prize. I watched her in cap and gown, walking across the stage, receiving her diploma. I cried so hard, my hands trembled. She hugged me, but not with the fervor I expected. It was polite, almost formal, and when I asked if she was happy, she replied, "Now it's my life, Mom. I need to walk on my own 2 feet." That night, I realized, maybe to her, I was no longer a mother. I was just a stepping stone. A stepping stone you push off of to reach something greater. But I accepted it. I accepted it because I believed a mother's love doesn't demand immediate gratitude. I accepted it because I thought, deep down, she would always know that one day she would look back and say, it was because of her. Now, years later, sitting at that dinner table, listening to the groom reduce me to a joke, the old woman who pays the bills, I realized that day might never come. Perhaps to her, I was never a heroine. Perhaps I was always just the invisible line on the check. When everyone in the restaurant laughed, I remembered every night I cried silently into my pillow, every time I gave up something for myself so she could have more, every time I thought, it will be worth it. Their laughter showed me maybe it hadn't been worth it. Not because I hadn't given everything, but because, in their minds, everything was never seen as love. It was only seen as obligation. I swallowed another sip of water, and inside me, something shifted. It wasn't pure anger, it was clarity. The clarity of someone who finally understands. Sacrifice is not eternal if respect does not accompany it. I set my glass down. I smiled discreetly, at no one in particular, and I began to recall every battle I had won, not as a victim, but as a warning. I survived abandonment. I survived debt. I survived doors slammed in my face because I was a woman. I survived the contempt of clients, the laughter of men who thought I didn't belong in the business world, and now, I would survive the contempt of my own blood. I looked at them, my daughter and her fiancé, and saw 2 children who had never learned the difference between support and submission. They confused generosity with duty. They confused love with a wallet. And there, in that moment, I understood, if my whole life had been spent giving her wings, now it was time to remember that even wings need the right wind. That night, I decided the wind would change. They thought they could laugh at me. What they didn't know was that every laugh was only fuel for the fire of my decision. I wouldn't shout. I wouldn't cry. I would simply write, in silence, the part of the story they had yet to discover. The dinner went on, but I no longer heard the conversations around me. The groom's words still echoed like a drum inside my head. After all, you're paying for everything, aren't you? I watched him boast loudly about investments, trips, influential friends. My daughter smiled, proud to stand beside him. And I, there at the end of the table, was nothing more than a dusty trophy they displayed without reverence. That it was, in that moment, I understood, waiting for gratitude was useless. Waiting for recognition was futile. I had to act. It would not be a scandal. It would not be a scream. It would be a move so subtle that, at first, no one would notice. But when they did, it would already be too late. I lowered my eyes discreetly, toward the purse in my lap. I opened the clasp carefully, without haste. My phone was inside, silent. I picked it up as one holds a weapon, steady, without trembling. The screen lit up my face. My fingers slid with certainty to the contact saved under asterisks. Victor, attorney, confidant, the only one who knew how to read my silence. I wrote a single message: suspend transfers, freeze all funds tied to the couple, effective immediately. Sent it by heartbeat firmly, but not fast. It was as if, finally, I had found a rhythm that belonged to me. Seconds later, the phone buzzed. A short reply: understood. I closed the phone, placed my hands calmly back on the table, picked up my fork, cut the meat delicately, and raised a piece to my mouth. Around me, laughter continued. The clinking of glasses filled the air. But inside me, something had shifted. I knew that, within hours, every gift promised under the name of the generous mother, every luxurious trip they expected, every financial favor they were counting on, would vanish like smoke. And they had no idea. They still saw me as the open account. They had no clue I had already closed the ledger. I drank a sip of water. And for the first time that night, I truly smiled. As the dinner went on, small signs began to appear. A waiter leaned in, whispering something to the maître d'. He frowned, glanced in my direction, and discreetly walked away. I noticed, but didn't move. The groom ordered a special wine from the list. The waiter hesitated, checked, and with a strained smile explained it was not available. The groom complained, then forced a laugh, trying to mask his irritation. To others, it looked like nothing more than a small detail. To me, it was the first crack in the ice. My daughter, seated beside me, avoided my gaze. She spoke with a cousin, about flowers, about dresses, about trips, as if I weren't there at all. I looked at her from the corner of my eye and thought, you have no idea what your mother just set in motion. And it was in that contrast, his loud laughter, her polite silence, and the cold serenity inside me, that I felt the power of what had begun. The world does not collapse with a roar. It begins to crumble in nearly invisible fractures. And that night, I had opened the first. I smiled faintly when the groom called the waiter for the third time to complain about a late dish. The waiter apologized, sweating, but the embarrassment was already circulating among the guests. Some whispered, others merely raised eyebrows. The dinner, meant to be a spectacle of perfection, was beginning to reveal its flaws, and I, silent, only observed, as I always had. But this time, I wasn't just a witness, I was the author. When dessert arrived, plain, lacking the expected sophistication, I noticed glances of disappointment. No words were needed for me to know what they thought. I thought the bride's mother was paying for everything. Ah, how that thought spread from mouth to mouth. I could almost hear it, and for the first time, it didn't hurt. It satisfied me, because this was not humiliation, it was justice. They had laughed at me as the old woman footing the bill. Well now, there was no bill paid. I lifted my eyes, met the groom's gaze, and for the first time that night, he hesitated before smiling. There was something in my eyes he didn't recognize, something that unsettled him. And I thought, good evening, my dear. The game has begun. They still didn't know, but the whispers in that dining room were only the beginning, and every stifled laugh that night would turn into sharp barbs against them, because in society, nothing spreads faster than the suspicion that the fortune is no longer guaranteed. The sound of silverware changed. It was no longer the lively rhythm of a festive dinner, but a hesitant clinking, as if every guest thought twice before lifting their fork. It was subtle, almost imperceptibly, but I had learned to live off details, and that night, details were everything. The groom tried to keep his voice loud, exaggerated, as though smiles could plaster over cracks. He spoke of a new business venture, of contacts overseas, of figures that perhaps existed only in his imagination. My daughter laughed, forcing a shine into her eyes, but the room no longer followed them. I heard the first phrase whispered just behind me. Funny. They said the French wine had been confirmed. Now it's just house wine. Soon, another voice, further away, and the dessert changed last minute. I thought her mother was paying for everything. Ah, there it was, the first thread pulled from the fabric. And, as always, once a thread is pulled, the whole embroidery threatens to unravel. The maitre d', once impeccable, moved too quickly between the tables. A waiter discreetly spilled a drop of wine while serving. Details, small, but enough to feed suspicion. Society is built on appearances, and nothing terrifies more than the suspicion that appearances aren't real. I drew a long breath. The air smelled of lilies mixed with unease. I looked around, aunts in lace dresses leaning in to whisper, the groom's cousins trading smirks, poorly concealed, older guests watching silently, judging every movement like an invisible courtroom. I didn't need to move a muscle. The room was working for me, and then I overheard the night's microstory. A guest, a distant family acquaintance, rose from the table nearby and walked toward the bar. He didn't know I could hear him. He spoke softly to another man, but his words reached me. Curious, isn't it? Just last week he told me his mother-in-law was footing the bill for the honeymoon trip. Now it seems that's not the case. The other man laughed. These kids, they want to flaunt more than they can afford. Looks like the mother's had enough. I felt the heat of non-existent wine course through my veins. I hadn't drunk a single drop that night, but I was intoxicated by it, gossip turning into truth. My daughter glanced around, sensing the shift. Her smile grew tighter. Her eyes sought approval, but found only cold observers. She fidgeted with her napkin, restless. The groom, irritated, complained to the waiter for the third time, but no one took his side anymore. I remained silent, took another sip of water, and I thought, they don't know it yet, but the real banquet tonight isn't on the plates, it's in the sharpened tongues around the table. The atmosphere of the hall had shifted. The laughter that once flowed freely now seemed stuck in people's throats. But there are always those who cannot read silence. That's when I heard the slurred voice of a distant cousin of the groom, too young to understand limits, too old to blame immaturity. He had already drunk more than he should have. The smell of alcohol preceded him, mixed with cheap cologne that stubbornly tried to compete with the lilies in the air. He staggered closer to my chair, leaned on the table, and with a mocking smile, said loud enough for others to hear, "So, Aunt, they say you're the one paying for everything anyway. Maybe you've got a few bucks left to finance my party too." Some guests laughed awkwardly, others pretended not to hear. My daughter blushed but said nothing. The groom chuckled, complicit, as if it were just harmless fun. I looked at the young man. I didn't respond right away. I simply stared at him with the calm of someone who had survived much greater insults, unsettled by my silence. He pressed on, "I'm serious, Aunt. If you're that generous, maybe you could sponsor some luxuries for the whole family, huh? After all, what's money for if not to spend?" My heart thudded firmly, not with anger, but with clarity. Clarity that it wasn't only my daughter and her fiancé. That attitude had already contaminated others. To them, I wasn't a person. I was a bank. As he spoke, I recalled another scene, years earlier. I was in a boardroom, surrounded by men in suits. We were discussing numbers, contracts, deadlines. One of them, smug, slammed his hand on the table and said, "Sweetheart, leave the numbers to those who understand them. Your role here is just to sign and smile." And smile I did, but I signed the entire contract under my own name. Months later, that very man was working for me. Back in the present, I looked at the insolent cousin and, still silent, raised my glass of water. I didn't have to say a word. The weight of my silence killed his laughter in his throat. Other guests noticed. Some exchanged glances. Others murmured quietly. My daughter tried to change the subject, but the scene was already marked. The joke hadn't struck me. It had backfired on him. Inside, I smiled, because I had learned that sometimes silence is more cruel than any reply. The cousin shuffled away, embarrassed, but before leaving, he tried to salvage his dignity with one more line. "Ah, don't take it the wrong way, Aunt. I was just kidding. Everyone knows you're the queen of the vault." The word hung in the air, vault, and I thought, if they think I'm a vault, then let them learn. Vaults also know how to lock themselves shut. I didn't know it yet, but that night would show me something worse than insolent cousins and drunken jokes. The true betrayal would not come from the outside, it would come from within. And it was then, in the hallway on the way to the restroom, that I overheard something not whispered at the tables, but spoken by my own daughter. I rose from the table with the excuse that I needed the restroom. My legs felt heavy, not from physical fatigue, but from the weight of silence. I crossed the dining room slowly, feeling eyes follow my steps. The hallway was dimmer, yellowish. Bulbs cast shadows on beige silk wallpaper. The carpet muffled my footsteps. I breathed deeply, trying to compose myself, and then I heard it. A side door was ajar. Voices slipped out, hushed but clear. First his voice, the groom. "Don't worry, sweetheart. She always gives in. It's her role." My skin turned cold. Then, my daughter's voice. Not in defense, not in protest, but in agreement. "I know. She's done her part. Now it's our turn to live our lives without asking for her blessing." Silence. My heart stopped for an instant. And then, his laugh. "Without her blessing, but with her credit card." The words struck me like invisible blades. It wasn't just him, it was her. My daughter. The little girl I carried on crowded buses. The child I fed rice and beans when there was nothing else. The one I tucked under a worn blanket on cold nights. My daughter. I stepped back unintentionally, and the carpet groaned. The voices ceased. My heart raced, but my face stayed cold. I walked again, slowly, as if nothing had happened. In the hallway mirror, I saw my reflection. Eyes wet, but not with tears. They were the eyes of someone who, for the first time, no longer saw illusion. I entered the restroom, closed the door, and leaned against the wood. My hands gripped the sink tightly. I looked at myself in the mirror, and there she was, a whole woman but betrayed. A quick flashback consumed me. My daughter, 6 years old, on her first day of school, whispering, "Don't leave, Mom." My daughter, 12, asking for a new backpack I bought on installments. My daughter, 20, crying after failing her first job interview, and me telling her she had worth, that the world would see it someday. And now, that same voice was laughing, saying, "Now it's our turn," without asking her blessing. I took a deep breath. The pain wasn't just offense, it was amputation. The realization that the blood that came from me now flowed in veins of ingratitude. I washed my face, smoothed my hair. I left the restroom with my posture straight, as if nothing had happened. The gift was still to come. Not the one wrapped in golden boxes, but the one they thought they could give me. Using my own name, I returned to the table and found an uneasy silence. The guests still laughed, but it was forced laughter, like torn wrapping paper covering something broken. The groom, still with a glass of wine in his hand, stood up and called for the room's attention. "We'd like to take this special dinner to honor the woman who made all of this possible." Eyes turned toward me. My daughter smiled, but it was a tense smile, too rehearsed. I remained still, my water glass between my fingers. The groom opened a golden envelope and pulled out a stack of papers. He spoke loudly, with pomp. "This is our gift to you, Margaret. A luxury trip to Europe. Everything booked, all in your name." There was timid applause. I extended my hand and took the papers. I looked calmly, and then I saw plane tickets, hotel reservations, exclusive dinners, even yacht excursions. But at the bottom, one detail burned hotter than any insult. The reservations had all been made with my credit card, that it was a gift wrapped with my own money, a fraud disguised as generosity. My stomach turned, but I kept my face serene. I smiled faintly, not for them, but for myself, as they spoke, as the guests clapped without noticing the irony. I thought of the real gifts. I remembered the drawing my daughter made for me at 7 years old. A crumpled piece of paper, 2 figures holding hands, a crooked sun in the corner. She had written, in shaky letters, "For the best mom in the world." That was the most precious gift I ever received. I also remembered the first cake she tried to bake on her own, at 13. Burned on the outside, raw on the inside, but offered with eyes full of pride. I ate every bite, pretending delight, because what mattered was never the taste, it was the gesture. And now, years later, she offered me a luxurious trip that was not a gift, it was theft. It was abuse disguised as a tribute. It was confirmation that, to them, I was nothing but a resource. The room kept applauding. My daughter raised her glass. The groom kissed her hand. I kept my restrained smile. And inside me, I made the final decision. They would get nothing more. When the applause died down, I thanked them with a nod. I said nothing more than thank you, and that unsettled them more than any speech ever could. They thought they had given me a gift. What they didn't know was that very night, I would begin to wrap the true gift I would leave for them: emptiness. The room had already swallowed the gift that was no gift at all. Applause still lingered, rehearsed smiles still flashed, but deep down, I knew. Many had seen the irony. It was in that moment I heard the voice that cut the deepest, not for its tone, but for what it carried from the past. It was Aunt Selina, my ex-husband's distant sister, whom I hadn't seen in years. She had never liked me, always considered me too ambitious. And now, with dessert in front of her, she used her fork as if it were a microphone. "Well, the girl's always been a handful, hasn't she? Good thing you've always had deep pockets. Otherwise, I don't know what would have become of her." The words fell onto the table like stones. Some guests chuckled awkwardly. My daughter bit her lower lip. The groom pretended not to hear, but I heard every syllable as if it were an echo from the past. As Selina spoke, I remembered a distant Christmas. My daughter was 10, the house was decorated, but the gifts were modest. I had wrapped a simple doll, bought with effort. When she opened the package, her cousins unwrapped expensive, imported toys, and someone, perhaps Selina herself, remarked, "Poor thing, always with less." I remember the shame in my daughter's eyes. I remember the pain in mine. That night, I promised she would never feel that again. A promise I kept, with sweat, sleepless nights, countless sacrifices. And now, years later, the same aunt chewed her dessert and spat venom. Good thing she had you to bankroll her, because I've never seen much willpower in that one. I drew a deep breath, looked straight at Selina, didn't answer. Silence was my reply, but inside me, something hardened. It wasn't enough for the past to steal my nights. Now they want to steal the credit too. No, not this time. I smiled discreetly and thought, let them talk. The echo of words carries no weight against the decisions I've already made. At that table, I realized the insults weren't new, they had always been there, disguised as jokes or casual remarks. The difference was that, this time, I would not swallow them. This time, I would return them. They believed they had given me a gift. They didn't realize they had just handed me the final proof of who they truly were. I discreetly reached for my purse. The clasp opened with a soft click. My fingers touched the phone. On the screen, the conversation with Victor was still open. The first order had already been carried out, suspension of transfers to the couple. Now it was time to conclude. I typed, slow and precise, amend the will. Remove automatic privileges for the couple. Redirect part of the trust to social initiatives. Priority, immediate execution. I hit send. I closed the purse, leaned back in my chair, and breathed like someone finishing a long race. The relief was physical, as if I had lifted a stone off my back that I had carried for years. I raised my water glass and drank in silence, and for the first time that night, I felt like I was toasting myself. While they laughed, I sank into memories. Not bitter ones, but memories of silent victories. I recalled the first major contract I closed for my company. In that meeting, surrounded by men in suits who doubted me, I signed without hesitation. I left the room with a discreet smile and heard one of them mutter, "She won't last more than 6 months." It lasted 20 years. And every brick I built came from that contract. That night, the feeling was the same. They underestimated me. They laughed at my expense. But I had already signed the decision that would change the game. Back at the dinner table, I noticed guests beginning to comment on the trip. One asked about the destination, another about the excursions. My daughter smiled, describing every detail as if it had been her idea. The groom interrupted, boasting about securing the best experience for his mother-in-law. I simply observed, calm, steady, invisible to those who didn't know how to look. But inside me, silence had turned into triumph. Not a noisy victory, but the victory of someone who shuts the door before the storm breaks in. And I thought, they don't know it yet, but they're already living in a castle without inheritance. When the time for the toast arrived, everyone expected words of celebration. What they received was something else entirely. I didn't shout. I didn't cry. I simply raised my glass and let each word become the sharpest blade I had ever wielded. The room buzzed with whispers. Every table was a little courtroom, quietly judging what had just happened. But in the middle of that murmur, a different voice approached. "Margaret." I turned my head and found a presence I hadn't expected. Henry, an old family friend. A face marked by time, silver hair, eyes still alive. He smiled with sincerity, a rare gesture that night. He sat beside me for a moment, as if he didn't mind taking up space. He spoke softly, so only I could hear, "You're still the same. Strong. They have no idea what you built." My heart warmed. It was the first time that entire night someone spoke to me as a person, not as a wallet. He continued, "I remember when you almost gave up on the company. I was there, remember, when no one believed, and you still signed that contract." I smiled in silence. Yes, I remembered. I remembered how he had quietly offered me a modest loan when the bank shut its doors on me. I never had to use the money, but the gesture stayed forever, because, in that moment, I realized someone believed in me, and now, years later, he repeated the gesture, not with money, but with words. As Henry spoke, I saw my daughter in the distance, laughing at something the groom whispered to her, and I noticed the contrast. On one side, an old friend who remembered my struggle, on the other, my own blood, incapable of recognizing a single scar I carried. Henry held my hand for a brief moment. "Don't let it break you. The night may seem like theirs, but the story is yours. And those with the story, Margaret, always win in the end." My eyes watered, but I didn't let the tear fall. I only smiled. A small smile, but a true one. He rose, returned to his table, and I was left with his words echoing inside me. "The story is yours." I drew a deep breath, and for the first time that night, I realized I wasn't completely alone. Yes, there was mockery. Yes, there was ingratitude. But there were also witnesses. And there were those who remembered. And I thought, if the story is mine, then tonight I will write a chapter they will never forget. The room called for silence. It was time for the toast. And for the first time that night, it wasn't the groom who stood. It was me. The metallic sound of a spoon against a glass echoed through the room. One of the groomsmen called for silence, announcing the moment for the toast. The guests turned forward, waiting. Everyone expected the groom to speak. Some imagined it would be my daughter, but I knew, if it wasn't me, it would be another night when the truth went unnoticed. Before the groomsman could hand over the microphone, I stood. The navy blue dress weighed on me, but my legs were steady. I lifted my glass of water. Allow me to say a few words. A murmur swept the room. My daughter looked at me, surprised. The groom, uncomfortable, forced a smile. I drew a deep breath, looked around, and began. Tonight is a night of celebration, and celebrations call for toasts. But a toast isn't only about raising a glass. A toast is a choice of what you wish to remember. The silence grew. All eyes were on me. It was as if, for the first time that night, I wasn't seen as a spectator, but as a voice. I continued, steady. Some believe life is measured by expensive trips, luxurious gifts, paid bills. I myself spent years believing that if I gave everything of myself, I would earn respect in return. But I learned, at a high cost, that respect cannot be bought. Respect is given, or denied, in silence, in small gestures, in eyes that do not turn away. I saw my daughter lower her eyes. The groom pressed his lips tight. I smiled, but without sweetness. Tonight, I want to toast, not to displays of wealth, not to appearances. I want to toast to love that doesn't come with a receipt, to care that doesn't need proof of purchase, to generosity that isn't disguised as a gift paid with someone else's wallet. Some guests drew deep breaths. Others exchanged glances. The weight of the words fell across every corner of the hall. And then I finished. To those who confuse love with a bank account, I wish only that one day they discover the difference. To those who already know the difference, I offer this toast. May you never have to prove your worth with silence, but if you must, may you know that silence itself can be a weapon. I raised my glass, drank, and sat. The room fell silent for several seconds. Then, timid applause began. First, an older woman from a distant branch of the family, then, to longtime friends. Soon, half the room was applauding. The groom didn't know where to look. My daughter tried to smile, but her face betrayed her shame. And I, there, finally breathed in peace. The sound of applause faded slowly, like waves dying on the shore. The room returned to its chatter. But for a moment there was something greater than any voice. Silence. The weight of the empty glass still in my hand, as if I had just released an invisible sword. I didn't need to say anything else, but I wanted to observe. That's when I noticed. My daughter was motionless, her smile frozen, her fingers crushing the napkin until it was crumpled. She didn't look me in the eyes. She didn't look at anyone. Her silence screamed louder than any words I remembered when she was a teenager. Every time I confronted her about something, a small lie, a bad grade, a secret night out, she would retreat into that same silence, eyes downcast, lips pressed tight, restless hands. It wasn't remorse. It was escape. It was cowardice. And there, in front of dozens of guests, she repeated the gesture, not to protect herself, but to avoid facing the truth she had just heard. The groom, beside her, still tried to laugh. He spoke loudly to his cousins, trying to distract himself, but she didn't join in. She shrank. I discreetly fixed my gaze on her. I waited for her to lift her eyes. I waited for a sign, perhaps gratitude, perhaps anger, perhaps any emotion at all, but none came. She remained silent, and I understood. It wasn't respect, it was absence, an absence of courage to defend, to acknowledge, to take a stand. The silence of my daughter hurt more than any insult from the groom, because within it there was no cruelty, there was cowardice, and cowardice, I realized, is colder than contempt. Drank the last sip of my water, placed the glass on the table, and thought, if her silence is escape, then mine will be a sentence. I stood, left the table without haste. Behind me, I heard only the clinking of silverware returning to motion, and the silence of my daughter followed me to the door. That night, I discovered there is no loneliness greater than that of a mother before the silence of her own daughter, but it was in that emptiness that I found my strength, because if even she remained quiet, then I would be the only voice capable of ending that story. The dinner ended like a poorly staged play. Waiters cleared the plates, Guests rose in small groups, whispering as they made their way to the door. It wasn't the cheerful murmur of a successful party. It was the hushed chatter of an audience that had just witnessed an unforgivable slip. I walked slowly toward the foyer, feeling eyes turned to me. They weren't looks of pity. They were looks of curiosity, of restrained respect. I had spoken the words no one else dared to say. Behind me, I caught the first exchange that confirmed it. "Did you hear what she said? What a precise strike." Another replied, "Strike." That was direct, my friend, and well deserved. I smiled faintly without turning my head. I didn't need to see who spoke. It was enough to know the narrative no longer belonged to them. As I waited for the driver, the night air brought relief, the scent of flowers mixed with a gentle chill. I closed my eyes for a moment and thought. I didn't need to raise my voice. Lifting the glass was enough. The house was silent when I returned. No more forced laughter, no more uncomfortable applause, only the ticking clock on the wall and the sound of my own footsteps across the cold floor. I set my purse on the table, slipped off my shoes, and walked to the living room. The navy blue dress still weighed on me, as if it had absorbed the heaviness of the night. I sat in my favorite armchair, the one I had bought years ago on a modest trip, yet it always gave me comfort. I closed my eyes. The image of the dining hall still lingered, the glasses raised, the confused stares, the silence after my words. I knew that from that moment on, nothing would be the same. That the next morning, confirmation arrived early. The phone rang before 9. It was an old friend, her voice buzzing with excitement. "Are you seeing the message groups? Everyone's talking about your toast." I smiled in silence. She continued, "They say the groom went pale. Your daughter didn't know where to hide her face. And you were simply masterful." I hung up calmly, opened my laptop. The first notes in the society columns were already circulating. An elegant dinner marked by a memorable speech. Others wrote, "Not every toast is celebration. Some are verdicts." Each word was a blade, not mine, theirs. Society, always hungry for drama, had already chosen a side, and I knew nothing corrodes faster than rumor. Years of prestige can collapse from a single well-placed remark. And that night, every guest had carried a story home, a story that did not favor my daughter or the groom. I smiled again, remembering when I myself had once been the victim of unfair gossip. At the start of my business, they said I only closed deals because I had connections behind closed doors. Back then, I cried in silence. Tonight, I did not cry. Tonight, the whispers were my allies. But the cruelest blow was still to come. It would not be dealt by me, nor by the guests. It would come from silence. Inside my own home, sitting in the armchair, I ran my hand across it, feeling the worn fabric, and I thought, how many times have I sat here, alone, asking myself if I was doing the right thing? The difference was that this time, I had no doubts. I was doing the right thing. I stood and walked to an old drawer. Inside, I kept memories, photos, letters, drawings. I pulled out one in particular, the drawing my daughter made when she was 7. 2 figures holding hands, a crooked sun in the corner, and the words, "For the best mom in the world." I held the paper for a few minutes. I felt a tear slide down my face, but it wasn't from pain. It was mourning. Mourning for the daughter who once saw in me what she no longer sees. I placed the drawing back, closed the drawer. And as I did, I felt I was also closing a door inside myself. I returned to the armchair, glanced at the clock. The hours passed, but inside me, time seemed to have finally stopped. I whispered softly, as if someone might hear, "Money can buy meals, but only respect can serve dessert." I smiled faintly, because I knew that, from now on, that would be my truth. And it no longer mattered who laughed or who whispered. I had won, not with shouts, not with scandal, but with silence and dignity. That night, I understood. I didn't need to raise my voice. I only needed to remind them that love is not measured in bills paid, and that silence, when chosen wisely, is the greatest inheritance a mother can leave. And you, have you ever gone through something like this? What would you have done in my place? Tell me in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, hit the like button and subscribe to the channel to follow the next ones.